At the party tonight, pretend you're not with me. I stood there, still holding the cufflinks I was about to fasten onto my fiancé's sleeves when Mark uttered those words. He didn't even look at me. He was too busy admiring his own ambitious reflection in the mirror. No argument broke out. There was only the sound of my heart fracturing bone-dry and silent. At 38, I was smart enough to know that this wasn't a casual request. It was an erasure. Mark wanted to walk into that room as a golden bachelor, and my presence, the presence of the woman who had built him from nothing, had suddenly become a debt he intended to default on. He expected me to be wounded. He expected me to cry and retreat into the shadows. But he was wrong. I still drove him there. I still smiled as I watched him enter the grand gala. And then I granted him his wish. I vanished. But Mark forgot one fatal detail. In that room filled with the city's most powerful politicians and elites, they respected him for one reason and one reason only. They respected me. Don't turn away, because what happens 3 hours later is not a common scene of jealousy. It is the moment my silence becomes the sharpest blade in the room. When the spotlight shifts and the elite begin to ask the real questions, Mark will realize the true cost of disowning the woman who created him. It is a slow, high-class, and entirely deserved reckoning. You will see that when a mature woman decides to reclaim her dignity, she doesn't need to raise her voice, she only needs to let the truth finish the job. My name is Brooke, and at 38, I have built a life defined by the weight of my word and the sharpness of my judgment. As a director of college admissions for one of the most prestigious institutions on the East Coast, I spend my days navigating a world of high-stakes ethics, institutional integrity, and the delicate art of assessing character. I am a woman who trusts patterns over promises, a philosophy that has served me well in boardrooms, but as I was about to discover had left me blind in my own living room. The evening of the Sterling Gala was supposed to be the crowning achievement of a 4-year partnership with Mark. Mark, at 41, was an ambitious consultant who moved through the world with a polished kinetic energy that I had once mistaken for passion. We were the power couple of our social circle, the educator and the strategist, a foundation built on shared goals and mutual respect. Or at least that was the story I had been telling myself. As I sat at my vanity, the hum of the city outside felt distant compared to the sudden icy clarity settling in my chest. I began to look at the reflection of our life together not as a romance, but as a series of data points. I realized then that the erasure hadn't started that night. It had been a slow, methodical campaign of social conditioning. Over the past 6 months, Mark had been subtly editing me out of his public narrative. I remembered a dinner 3 weeks prior where he had introduced me to a potential investor as a dear friend and advisor, omitting the word fiancé entirely. When I questioned him later, he had laughed it off, calling it a tactical move to keep the focus on the business. Then there were the photographs. Mark was an avid poster on professional networking sites and social media. Yet I noticed a trend in every group shot. I was the one partially cropped out or relegated to the soft focus background. He had started referring to our shared brownstone as my place when speaking to colleagues, and our upcoming vacation as a trip I'm taking. At the time, I had dismissed these moments as the quirks of a man under immense professional pressure. I am a woman of logic, and I told myself that a title or a pronoun didn't change the reality of our commitment. But sitting there watching him adjust his tuxedo in the mirror, I saw the anatomy of a predator. He wasn't just a man seeking success. He was a man strategically deconstructing my identity to make room for a version of himself that didn't include me. He had been practicing my absence, one polite omission at a time, preparing our social circle for a world where I simply didn't exist. It was a cold, calculated grooming process designed to make me accept less visibility until I became invisible, even to myself. Mark turned away from the mirror, his expression a mask of practiced composure. He didn't look at me with the warmth of a man about to escort his future wife to a celebration. Instead, he looked at me with the clinical detachment of a surgeon about to perform a necessary but unpleasant procedure. He checked his watch, then his phone, before finally meeting my eyes. The room felt smaller, the air thinner. "Brooke," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "I need to ask a favor for tonight. It's about the Vanguard project. The stakeholders are going to be there, and the optics are delicate." He paused, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle in his sleeve. At the party tonight, I need you to pretend you're not with me. We should arrive separately or at least walk in at different times. If anyone asks, you're there on behalf of the university. It's a strategic career move for both of us. If I appear unattached, it changes the leverage I have with the lead donor's daughter, who is a key influencer in the group. You understand, don't you? It's for our future. I froze. My hand, which had been reaching for a pair of vintage pearl earrings, remained suspended in mid-air. It wasn't the request itself that paralyzed me. It was the chilling ease with which he delivered it. He framed my humiliation as a professional necessity, a shared sacrifice for a collective future he had already begun to dismantle. This was gaslighting in its purest form, convincing me that being publicly disowned was an act of loyalty. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't offer an ultimatum. He simply acted as if my compliance was an absolute certainty, a foregone conclusion based on the supportive role he had spent months conditioning me to play. In that heavy, suffocating silence, the patterns I so dearly valued finally clicked into place. This wasn't just about a gala or a project. This was a tactical strike. He was testing the final boundary of my self-respect. If I walked into that room as a ghost tonight, I would never truly be seen again. Mark wasn't just asking for a night of independence. He was conducting a rehearsal for my permanent deletion. He wanted the prestige I brought to his arm without the obligation of the woman attached to it. He wanted my intellectual capital to back his plays, but he wanted the social freedom of a man who owed no one anything. As I looked at him, I realized he didn't see a partner. He saw a line of code that needed to be rewritten. I didn't scream, and I didn't argue. I simply nodded a slow, deliberate movement that he took for submission. He smiled, a thin, satisfied curve of the lips, and headed for the door, confident that he had successfully managed his most difficult asset. I stayed behind for a moment, staring at my reflection, realizing that the woman in the mirror was about to become Mark's greatest mistake. I didn't know it then, but that sentence wasn't a request for a favor. It was a digital edit of my entire existence. The heavy oak doors of the Sterling ballroom swung open, releasing a wave of champagne-scented air and the low rhythmic hum of high society chatter. Under normal circumstances, I would have walked in with my arm, looped through Mark's our presence, a synchronized statement of stability and success. But tonight, the air between us was a vacuum. Mark stepped across the threshold first, his stride purposeful and brisk, leaving me to trail 3 paces behind like an unacknowledged shadow. The room was a glittering labyrinth of silk and sapphire, a world I had navigated for over a decade with the confidence of a woman who knew her place. Yet as we moved deeper into the crowd, the familiar geometry of the social space felt distorted. Mark was operating with a new, ruthless efficiency, his eyes scanning the room, not for friends, but for prey. When an old acquaintance, a high-ranking trustee from the university, approached us with a warm smile, I felt a flicker of hope for normalcy. But before I could even part my lips to say hello, Mark stepped into the gap. He offered a firm handshake and introduced me with a voice that was smooth as glass and just as cold, calling me a longtime colleague from the admissions circuit, who was here to represent the academic side of the evening. The cruelty wasn't in a raised voice or an insult. It was in the sterile strategic distance he maintained. He didn't ignore me entirely, that would have been sloppy. Instead, he managed me. He steered the conversation toward his own recent ventures, physically pivoting his body so that I was pushed to the periphery of the circle, an auxiliary figure whose only role was to nod at his brilliance. I stood there feeling the sensory weight of being unseen in a room full of people who had known my name for years. I felt the phantom itch of my engagement ring beneath my silk gloves, a secret that now felt like a lead weight. Every time someone looked my way with a hint of recognition, Mark would subtly shift the focus, weaving a narrative where I was merely a professional acquaintance he happened to be mentoring. The humiliation was a slow, pulsing ache intensified by the polite smiles of people who sensed the shift in the atmosphere but were too well bred to point it out. The ache turned into a frigid, crystalline anger when I followed the sound of Mark's voice toward the mahogany bar where he was holding court with Elias Thorne, one of the most influential venture capitalists in the education sector. I lingered behind a large marble pillar, intending to step forward and reclaim my place. But the words falling from Mark's lips stopped me cold. He was pitching a revolutionary new ethics-based curriculum designed for elite preparatory schools, a project he claimed would disrupt the admissions landscape. As he spoke, my blood ran cold and the glass of sparkling water in my hand felt like it might shatter. He wasn't just lying about being single. He was reciting almost word for word the ethics framework I had spent 3 years developing for my doctoral thesis. He was describing my curriculum designs, my proprietary data on student retention, and my personal philosophy on institutional integrity as if they were the fruits of his own midnight oil. The edit Mark had requested back at the brownstone wasn't just about his social status or some imagined leverage with a donor's daughter. It was a cover for wholesale professional identity theft. He needed me hidden because my presence was a living, breathing contradiction to the story he was selling. If I were recognized as his partner, the donors would inevitably ask about my work, and the house of cards he was building with my stolen ideas would come crashing down. He wasn't just hiding a fiancé, he was burying a witness. I watched him gesture with a charisma that felt like a mockery, his eyes bright with the excitement of a man who believed he had successfully stolen the fire of the gods and silenced the only person who could take it back. In that moment, something shifted deep within me. The visceral pain of being excluded began to harden into the cold, calculated precision that had made me the youngest director of admissions in my university's history. I felt my professional persona take the wheel, a suit of armor that Mark had forgotten I possessed. I realized that in Mark's eyes, I had become a liability, a piece of old software to be uninstalled. But in this room, in this specific ecosystem of power and prestige, I was the one who actually understood the language being spoken. I stopped trying to catch Mark's eye, stopped looking for a shred of remorse or a signal to rejoin the fold. Instead, I began to map the room. I looked past Mark, focusing on the people he was so desperate to impress. I observed Elias Thorne's subtle skepticism, the way he tilted his head when Mark stumbled over a technical detail of his curriculum. I saw the lead donor's daughter, the influential key influencer Mark had mentioned, and I noted her bored expression as Mark tried too hard to be charming. I was no longer a victim of an erasure. I was a strategist observing a failing performance. Mark had given me the ultimate gift of anonymity, and I intended to use it. I began to drift through the crowd, not as Brooke the jilted fiancé, but as Brooke the expert. I made eye contact with the university's chancellor, offering a knowing professional nod that bypassed Mark entirely. I began to place myself in the sightlines of Mark's targets, letting them see me the real architect without ever acknowledging the man who was desperately trying to pretend I wasn't there. I was building my own footprint in the room quietly and strategically, preparing the ground for a shift in the power dynamic that Mark couldn't even imagine. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game of chess, but he had forgotten that I was the one who taught him the rules. Mark thought he was hiding me to protect his lie, but he had actually given me the perfect vantage point to watch him fail. As the crowd shifted like a slow-moving tide, I found myself standing near the alcove where Julian Vane, the university's senior-most trustee, and a man whose family name was etched into the very stones of the campus, was nursing a scotch. Julian had always looked at me with a rare kind of professional kinship, and when our eyes met, he didn't see a longtime colleague or a friend of the firm as Mark had so desperately tried to paint me. He saw the woman who had once sat across from him in a closed-door board meeting and refused to admit the grandson of a $10 million donor because the boy's application was a fabric of ghost-written essays and inflated grades. Within the academic circles of this city, I was known as the Incorruptible, a title earned not through arrogance, but through a refusal to let the prestige of the institution be sold to the highest bidder. Julian gave me a curt, respectful nod, his eyes flicking briefly to Mark, who was still frantically networking across the room, and then back to me with a look of quiet amusement. It was in that silent exchange that the true nature of Mark's fear became undeniable. Mark wasn't ashamed of my age, my dress, or my social standing. He was terrified of my substance. He was a shortcut man, a weaver of illusions who relied on charm and momentum to bypass the hard work of actual merit. I, on the other hand, was a standard woman, I represented the very accountability he found suffocating. He understood that standing next to me didn't just make him look like a partner. It made him look like a subordinate to the very ethics he was trying to circumvent. My proximity was a mirror he couldn't afford to look into because it would reveal that his innovations were hollow shells without my intellectual scaffolding to hold them up. The realization brought a sharp, vivid memory to the surface, one that had been lurking in the shadows of my mind for months. 6 months ago, over a dinner that I had thought was a celebration of our engagement, Mark had leaned across the table, his voice lowered in a way I had mistaken for intimacy. He had asked me to look the other way on a minor compliance issue regarding a series of international applications linked to one of his new consulting clients. He had framed it as a victimless favor, a way to grease the wheels of a deal that would secure our financial future for a decade. I remembered the way the candlelight had caught the predatory glint in his eyes, the same glint I was seeing tonight. My refusal had been quiet, firm, and instantaneous. I told him that my integrity wasn't a commodity to be traded, not even for us. He had smiled and dropped the subject, but now watching him navigate the ballroom, I realized that was the day the edit truly began. He hadn't seen my refusal as a sign of character. He had seen it as a threat to his upward mobility. From that moment on, I wasn't his partner. I was a barrier. He had spent the last half-year diminishing my presence in his life because he realized he couldn't corrupt me, and if he couldn't corrupt me, he couldn't control me. For a man like Mark, a woman with a backbone is a liability that must be managed out of the narrative. He needed a version of a life where no one would ask the difficult questions I was prone to asking, a life where his shortcuts would go unnoticed because the person most likely to call them out had been relegated to the wings. I moved closer to the bar, staying just out of Mark's line of sight, but near enough to hear him as he was being grilled by a sharp-eyed dean from the School of Education. The dean was asking about the why behind the curriculum, the specific pedagogical theory that justified the aggressive ethics framework Mark was claiming as his own. I watched as Mark's confident smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. He began to repeat the buzzwords, the projected outcomes, the shiny statistics I had calculated, but he was drowning when it came to the foundational philosophy. He had the map, but he had no idea how the terrain was formed. He was a man who had stolen the sheet music but had never learned how to play the instrument. Usually in moments like these, I would have caught his eye from across the room and offered a subtle nod or stepped in with a clarifying comment that made his stumbling look like a deliberate pause for emphasis. I had spent years being his buffer, the invisible force that translated his half-baked ideas into visionary strategies. I had smoothed over his inconsistencies and filled in his blanks so often that he had started to believe the brilliance was his own. But tonight, the buffer was gone. I stood there sipping my water and watched him struggle. I saw the dean's brow furrow as Mark's explanation looped back on itself, becoming a word salad of corporate jargon that meant nothing to a true academic. I realized that Mark's greatest weakness wasn't his lack of knowledge. It was his belief that he didn't need me to succeed. He had demanded I be a stranger, and I would give him exactly that. I would not sabotage him with a scene, nor would I humiliate him with a public correction. That would be beneath the standards I lived by. Instead, I would simply withdraw the silent support that had kept him afloat for 4 years. I would let the vacuum of my absence do the work. He wanted to stand alone under the bright, unforgiving lights of this gala, claiming a victory he hadn't earned. He wanted to pretend that he was the sole architect of his rise. Fine. I would allow him to be exactly who he said he was. I would let the room see the man without the woman, the salesman without the product, the shortcut without the destination. If he wanted a life without my interference, I would give it to him, along with every consequence of standing alone. The moment of decision felt like a cold, clarifying draft in a room that had grown too stifling to breathe in. I smoothed the front of my silk dress, checked my reflection one last time to ensure my mask of professional composure was impenetrable, and moved toward the center of the room. Mark was still huddled with Elias Thorne and a small circle of the evening's most influential donors, his gestures becoming more animated as he tried to compensate for the growing emptiness of his arguments. I glided into the circle with a smile that was as bright as it was hollow. Mark's eyes widened, a flash of genuine panic flickering beneath his polished exterior, but I didn't give him a chance to redirect the flow. I placed a gentle sisterly hand on his forearm the first time I had touched him all night and looked directly at Elias Thorne. I told Elias that it was truly a privilege to see Mark finally getting the recognition he deserved for this initiative. I emphasized with a deliberate and devastating sweetness how Mark had insisted on working in total isolation, refusing even my minor input to ensure the project was a pure reflection of his own singular vision and integrity. I praised his sole authorship and his independent spirit, effectively building a pedestal so high and so narrow that he would have no room to move. By publicly anchoring him to the lie that this was entirely his creation, I wasn't just being supportive, I was sealing the exits. I had turned my poisoned praise into a legal and social contract. If the project succeeded, he was now publicly on the hook for every word he hadn't written. If it drew scrutiny, he had no partner to hide behind, no co-author to blame for the gaps in logic. I saw the blood drain from his face as he realized I had just locked him into a fraud he couldn't escape without admitting to the entire room that he was a thief. I offered a final gracious nod to the group, told them I didn't want to take up any more of Mark's well-earned spotlight, and turned to walk away. My exit was not a retreat. It was a surgical removal. I moved through the ballroom with the effortless grace of someone who belonged there, stopping only to leave my glass on a waiter's tray. I didn't look back at Mark. I didn't check to see if he was watching me leave. I walked straight to the cloakroom, retrieved my wrap, and stepped out into the cool, biting night air. The valet brought my car around the car that was registered in my name, the one Mark assumed would be waiting for him at the end of the night. I tipped the young man, slipped into the driver's seat, and felt the immense, heavy silence of the cabin wrap around me. I didn't call him. I didn't send a text explaining that I was tired or that I was done. I simply drove. Behind me, I had left a vacuum that I knew would begin to pull at the very foundations of his ego. I was his social shield, the person whose reputation for honesty gave him a borrowed credibility he had never earned. By taking that shield with me, I was leaving him naked in a room full of sharks who could smell blood from a mile away. The silence I left in that ballroom was louder and more destructive than any shouting match we could have had in the privacy of our home. I was finished with being the ghost in his machine. I was now the ghost haunting his performance. Back inside the gala, I knew exactly what was happening without having to see it. Without my presence to act as a silent translator, the cracks in Mark's performance began to widen into chasms. The donors, sharp-eyed men and women who had spent decades vetting people for a living, began to press him on the very points of pedagogy and compliance he had failed to master, without me there to catch his eye and offer a reassuring nod or to subtly steer a drifting conversation back to safe harbor. Mark's confidence began to curdle into desperation. He started to sweat, his answers becoming a repetitive loop of buzzwords that lacked the gravity of true expertise. People who had previously respected him because of his association with me, the incorruptible director of admissions, began to notice the hollow center of the man. They looked at the space where I had stood then back at Mark, and the math no longer added up. The edit he had so carefully engineered had backfired with a vengeance. By removing the person who made him look legitimate, he had exposed his own profound incompetence to the very people who held his future in their hands. He was a man standing on a stage he didn't own, reciting a script he didn't understand, while the audience slowly realized the lead actor was an imposter. By the time he realized I wasn't coming back to save the conversation, the room had already begun to sense the vacuum where his character should be. While I sat in the darkness of my car, the silence of the gala was being replaced by a much more dangerous sound, the collective realization of a room full of people who had spent their lives spotting fakes. Back inside, the sisterhood of silence was beginning to move. Eleanor Vance, a legendary philanthropist and a woman whose endorsement could make or break a career in this city, had been watching the entire evening with the sharp, unblinking eyes of a hawk. Earlier that night, before Mark's request had fully poisoned the air, I had helped Eleanor navigate a delicate conversation regarding a scholarship fund she was establishing. She knew my mind, she knew my voice, and more importantly, she knew my integrity. I watched from the periphery of my mind's eye as she finally cornered Mark near the ice sculpture. She didn't raise her voice. Women like Eleanor don't have to. She asked him a surgical question about the longitudinal data in his curriculum, a specific metric that only the person who had actually crunched the numbers could possibly know. Mark stammered, his face a canvas of escalating panic as he tried to improvise a response that sounded authoritative but said absolutely nothing. Eleanor didn't let him off the hook. She waited, the silence stretching until it became an accusation in itself. Then she delivered the killing blow with a voice like chilled silk. She leaned in and whispered loud enough for the surrounding circle to hear. At our age, Mark, a man who hides his partner usually has something else to hide, and in your case, it's clearly a lack of talent. In an instant, the social exclusion he had tried to impose on me shifted entirely onto him. He was no longer the Golden Bachelor. He was a suspicious character, a man whose very presence had become an embarrassment to the room. My phone began to vibrate in the cup holder, a frantic, rhythmic buzzing that signaled Mark's desperation. He was calling me once, twice, then, a third time, hoping I would answer, hoping I would be the good woman who would rush back inside to fix the disastrous impression he was making. He needed me to stand by his side, to vouch for his genius, and to smooth over the jagged edges of his fraud. I didn't answer. I watched the screen glow with his name until it went dark. Then I did something he never expected. I realized I had left my personal planner and a small silk clutch with my house keys in the private cloakroom reserved for the university's executive staff. I couldn't leave them behind. I stepped out of the car and walked back into the building. The atmosphere had shifted. The air was no longer buzzing with excitement. It was thick with a heavy, judgmental stillness. As I walked toward the cloakroom, the host of the evening, a man who had always been a close friend of our family, caught my arm. His face was etched with concern and confusion. "Brooke," he whispered, "Mark is falling apart in there. He's telling people some nonsense about a misunderstanding. Are you leaving with him? Should I send someone to find him?" I stopped and looked at him, my expression clear and perfectly calm. I didn't lower my voice. I spoke with the quiet authority of a woman who had nothing left to hide. "No," I replied. "Mark specifically requested that I not be with him tonight. I am simply honoring his wish." The truth was out, and it was devastatingly simple. The host recoiled as if I had struck him, the weight of my words sinking in. There was no longer any ambiguity, no strategic career move that could justify such a petty, cruel request. By confirming the lie without adding a single word of vitriol, I had stripped Mark of his last shred of dignity. I retrieved my items and walked back through the foyer. I could see into the ballroom from the doorway. The room had fallen into a heavy, suffocating silence. It wasn't the dramatic silence of a movie scene, but the crushing social silence of high society when it decides someone is no longer welcome. Mark was standing in a circle of people, but he was utterly alone. No one was looking at him. They were all suddenly intensely interested in the contents of their champagne flutes or the patterns on the carpet. He looked small, shrunken by the realization that he had traded his greatest asset for a spotlight that was now burning him alive. He looked toward the door and saw me one last time. I didn't wave, I didn't scowl, and I certainly didn't stay. I simply turned and walked out of the gala with my head held high, the click of my heels on the marble floor the only sound in the hallway. I felt a profound sense of lightness. Mark had spent months trying to build a stage where I didn't exist, and in the end, he was the one left standing in the dark. I didn't have to pull the curtain back. I just had to step away and let his own act fall apart. In the weeks that followed the Sterling Gala, there was no explosive scandal, no dramatic confrontation on the evening news, and no public shaming. In the refined, high-stakes world we inhabited, reputations do not explode. They cool. It is a slow, structural frost that starts at the edges of one's social circle and moves inward until the center is frozen solid. Mark's Vanguard project, the one he had so brazenly stolen and presented as his own, was quietly shelved by the Board of Trustees. There was no formal accusation of plagiarism, merely a polite one-paragraph memo stating a lack of institutional interest and a misalignment of core values. I watched from a distance as the invitations that used to clog our shared calendar began to dry up. Mark found himself excluded from the high-level committees and the intimate dinner parties where the real decisions were made. He was no longer a rising star. He was a cautionary tale, a man whose name was now associated with a specific kind of desperate dishonesty. He began to realize far too late that I had never been just a plus one or a supporting character in his life. I was the glue that had held his social and professional credibility together. Without my silent endorsement and my intellectual scaffolding, the persona he had spent years crafting simply lacked the structural integrity to stand. He had spent months trying to edit me out, only to find that he had removed the only part of the story that made people believe in him. The true depth of his delusion became clear a month later when my office phone rang. It was a senior executive recruiter from a rival institution, a woman I had respected for years. She was calling to conduct a final reference check for Mark, who had applied for a high-level administrative position. I was stunned that he had the audacity to list me as a professional reference, likely assuming that my academic kindness or my desire to avoid a mess would force me to be nice and help him secure the role. He thought I was still the woman who would catch him when he stumbled, even after he had tried to push me off the stage. When the recruiter asked for my honest assessment of his ability to lead and his commitment to institutional ethics, I took a long, steady breath. I didn't disparage him, and I didn't recount the night of the gala. Instead, I spoke with a perfect, neutral honesty that carried more weight than any insult. I told her, "Mark is excellent at following instructions when they are his own." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. It was a phrase that sounded like a compliment to the uninitiated, but to a seasoned recruiter, it was a siren of warning. It told her everything she needed to know about his lack of collaborative spirit, his ego, and his inability to adhere to a collective vision. Mark didn't get the job. That was the ultimate edit, the final quiet removal of my endorsement. He had wanted to see what his life looked like without my influence, and I was finally ensuring he got exactly what he asked for. While Mark's world continued to shrink, mine began to expand in ways I had never dared to imagine while I was busy buffering his mediocrity. Shortly after the Vanguard project was rejected, the Board of Trustees approached me with a proposal of their own. They didn't want Mark's hollowed-out version of the ethics curriculum. They wanted the real thing, and they wanted me to lead a new executive division to implement it across the entire university system. I was promoted to the very executive level Mark had coveted so desperately, a position earned through the very integrity he had tried to weaponize against me. A few months later, I found myself back in a ballroom this time for the inauguration of the new Ethics Center. The air was celebratory, and I moved through the room with a sense of peace that had been absent for years. I wasn't there to manage someone else's image or to hide in the shadows of an insecure man's ambition. I was the guest of honor. As I stood at the podium looking out at a sea of familiar faces who now looked at me with genuine respect, I realized the profound irony of Mark's request. He had asked for a version of life where I didn't exist, believing that my absence would somehow make him larger. Instead, it was my absence that finally allowed the world to see him for exactly what he was, and more importantly, it allowed the world to finally see me. I had spent so much time being the architect of his success that I had forgotten I could build my own. I looked out into the crowd and felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. I was no longer a ghost or a footnote in a man's desperate climb. I was the author of my own narrative now, and the man who had tried to erase me was nothing more than a fading memory in a story that had moved on without him. Mark had wanted a world without me, and I had been gracious enough to give it to him. I wasn't invisible. I was just the part of the story he wasn't smart enough to keep, and now that I've edited him out, my life finally makes perfect sense. If you felt a surge of pride watching Brooke reclaim her power, you are not alone. There is a unique, quiet satisfaction in seeing a woman of substance recognize her own worth and refuse to be dimmed by an insecure man's shadows. This story is a testament to the fact that integrity is not just a virtue, but the ultimate leverage in a world of pretenders. We would love to hear your perspective on Brooke's journey. Have you ever felt someone in your life was trying to edit out your contributions or minimize your presence? Or perhaps you have witnessed a Mark in your own professional circle who learned the hard way that a reputation is easier to lose than it is to build. Your insights and stories of resilience are what make this community so vibrant and strong. Please share your thoughts in the comments below to join the conversation with other like-minded viewers. If you found this story of slow burn justice and ultimate empowerment resonate with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you will never miss our deep dives into the lives of strong characters who turn betrayal into a masterclass in dignity. Thank you for watching, for sharing your wisdom, and for standing with us in the light of the truth.